Who owns the soul of the nation? In a land where memory is contested, blood has been spilled for property, and the soil itself holds stories too painful to tell. What does it mean to belong? I'm Beverley Schäfer here on The Truth Report, and this week we sit down with author Shane Brody of a brand new book coming out called South Africa, A Land Divided, a searing explanation of settler legacies, fractured identities, and the ever-burning question, what remains of land that has been politically weaponized? You know, reading the introduction of the book stirred something quite profound in me. I felt it like an ancestral ache, not just as you've used words, Shane, about a whisper in the past or a wail of the land, but I felt a deep grief of those buried memories, of abandoned homes and broken lineages that you've so well described. And so much so that I actually ran off to one of the online links that you had provided in the back of the book, only to discover, of course, that my own father's side of my family name, Schäfer, is one of the 1820 settler family surnames. And it just set everything in motion. It really just immediately took me back to understanding why this book is so important. So no wonder it actually stirs up such an emotion within you. So this conversation today is not just about a history. It's about an inheritance. It's about culture. It's about survival. And it's about reckoning. But before we unpack in detail, let me introduce the author to you. So Shane Brody is a commercial farmer. He's an author, a community developer. He comes from a lineage of great men. And with over 2 decades of direct involvement in rural upliftment and agricultural training across South Africa, Shane's writing emerges not from the halls of academia, but from the red earth, from the ground, the lived experience and the intergenerational memory of this land we call South Africa. Shane frames the book as a personal memoir and a national reckoning. It's rooted in the memory of land dispossession and the silences about settler histories. The opening situates the land as a conscious entity holding intergenerational trauma, of which I felt when I started this book. Shane, can you set the scene of this book for the viewer to understand the context in which it was written?
Okay, Bev, I think I should just maybe start very slightly with my history. So I grew up in a little town of the Eastern Cape called Lady Frere, which was a little frontier town named after Sir Bartle Frere's wife. So it was one of these little villages that was, formed or created as the settler, program expanded. So just in short, we were bought out there in 1974 when the apartheid era government wanted to form the homeland system. Well, when they did form the homeland system, that was fell under the Transkei. So my father and his family had been living there for about 4 generations. They were very intricately linked into the Xhosa people there because they used to trade with them. They used to buy and sell cattle, sell them cattle and buy cattle from them. So it was a very... Xhosa was my first language. I only learned to speak English at the age of 4, because my mother owned her own business and my father farmed. So we were bought out then, and then we moved up to Indwe. These are just a few things which we'll cover later in the interview. But so we then moved to Queenstown, where my 1820 settler descendants had moved to, from the Albany region. I went to Queen's College, which is the 4th oldest boys' school in South Africa. Had a very good education there. I then went on to Rhodes University, where I studied social science and covered subjects like anthropology, sociology. I did Xhosa as a subject there too. I did politics as a 1st and 2nd year subject. So yeah, after that, I went straight into farming. I didn't ever use, what I studied. I went into farming on, I wasn't farming with my father because at the time he was selling up to move on to retire at Kenton-on-Sea. So I bought a small farm near to Queenstown. And I then got into, in later years, I got into assisting communal farmers on behalf of foreign donors, to uplift their, let's say, farming operations in the Harewood district of what was the former Ciskei, which is just a little bit west of Queenstown. And I learned a lot of important things there. I learned a lot about development, what the aspirations are of communal farmers, what the aspirations are of emerging farmers, people who would like to leave that sector and own their own farm and own their own ground. I did a lot of research into, the shortfalls of these areas. Then obviously while I was working in those areas, I came upon a lot of these expropriated former commercial farms. And, to say that almost all of them, or not almost all of them were in a state of decay. So at the point in time I wanted to write a history on my family because I didn't know much about where I came from. I don't think many South Africans know where they came from, what their roots are. So I then thought, well, let's do this history of my family and look at a few other big farming families who are very well known in the Queenstown or the border region. And I then started writing and researching, and a lot of very interesting things came to light.
That's quite amazing. I'd really like to unpack this in more detail, Shane. And, for me, the first introductory passages to the book was the most hard-hitting, because you open up with the quote, "If the land could speak, it would not just whisper, it would wail." It's deeply emotional when you say that. Perhaps expand on that ancestral memory that you believe the land is holding.
I think what the viewers should understand is that the Eastern Cape was almost like a cauldron. It was a place of immense conflict. It was a place of immense emotion, during the frontier wars, which actually lasted 100 years. I don't think there are many wars on earth which went on for 100 years. So I just spoke about, my settler heritage, to indicate that it wasn't always easy. I mentioned in the book that I don't think a lot of the 1820 settlers came here knowing exactly what they were coming to and why they were coming here, because there was much dissatisfaction at the stage. These people were awarded, or they were given very, very, very small farms of about 100 acres, which was almost impossible to make a living on in this region. I now live in Albany again. I moved here from Queenstown about 3 years ago, so I basically came back to my roots. But it was a very difficult history, and it's not one that is widely known. We've got this impression that, the settlers came here and they were given land and they invaded lands, and a lot of that did happen. So, my book is not about trying to paint a very and only pretty picture of the settlers. But if you look at all the jostling and the fighting and the wars which occurred, one would think that today we would have a sort of a policy where we make the most of our land, quote unquote, and we try and make it viable. We try and make it contribute to society. But in my opinion, why I say the land would wail is that, it hasn't turned out in that way. Land has become a politicized, weaponized sort of a subject. And there's a lot about it which I maintain that the public needs to understand and that policymakers need to understand. So, if you consider all the conflicts and the skirmishes and whatever occurred in the Eastern Cape, and many people won't know that this is where the Groot Trek, the Great Trek, under people like Pieter Tief actually started. And this is also the place where people like Sir Theophilus Shepstone lived. He actually he had some of his junior school years in Bathurst, where he went to the Methodist Church. David Livingstone's wife also went to that little school. And he also had great impacts on what would occur in South Africa going forward. He was basically, he later annexed the Boer republics. He was a very strong and important figure in the taking Natal away from the Boers who wanted to make that a homeland. So, we've got these themes that come up, in my research, the concept of a homeland, of a place to own, to call your own. We've got in contemporary politics, we've got the escape exit movement, that looks at this whole notion of homeland. And it's all got to do with a sense of land, a sense of belonging, a sense of trying to own something. So it's a very, very complex situation, and it's not as simple as just saying, well, we want land, or we need land for our homeland, or, we want to nationalize all land. There are very, very complex historical things that, I urge the public at large to go into research and look at whatever you read in the history books. Is it true? Has it been slightly adapted? Has it been, we've got that same old saying that, the victor always writes history. So I went through all of these very acrimonious, things about the land. And if you consider that the Anglo-Boer War was started because of land, it was started because the Boers wanted to hold on to their farms, and the British wanted to basically turn the whole of South Africa into a republic. So I cover in the book too, about the various skirmishes and conflicts between Boers and English, and Boers and Zulu, and English and Zulu. It just seems to be, and I mentioned a very, quote in the book, I actually mentioned it twice, that we seem to have a history written in blood. And I just think that it's not something that we need to keep on repeating. If we grapple with this land quote unquote issue, there are solutions. But I think the public at large and policymakers need to understand the intricacies of land, which I'll get into later.
So Shane, going on into the 1970s, you recount the expropriation of the Guba farms, resulting in despair, suicide among some of the generational farmers. Your father's life work was erased. You talk about the border of Transkei. You describe quite in quite detail, stating that it was decided upon politically rather than ethically. You talk about the personal trauma to your family, but you reflect on the ideological overreach in land reform. And you specifically refer to your father and grandfather both having endured forced removals. You wrote, and I quote, quite a powerful statement, which you said, "What we built through immense tenacity and seemingly endless pain was a simple sacrifice on the altar of ideology. Expropriation was not just justice, it was erasure." Tell us a little bit about that.
What I meant, in that quote or in that statement is that, when we were brought out in the Lady Frere region, it was very traumatic, obviously, because my father had been living there for 4 generations. And, we had to move. We had no option. We were given a price that we would be paid. And we moved up to Indwe, which was a little bit northeast of Lady Frere. And it just seemed, that there was no care about what happened to us. So my father went to these Indwe farms, which were basically fallow farms, and he re-established them through immensely hard work. It took him 15-hour working days. And just to be told again, that we're going to take that land to expand the size of the Transkei was a very, very difficult, if those expansions of the homeland system were going to benefit somebody, it was a very different story, but it actually didn't benefit anybody. I mentioned in my book, it created labor reservoirs as an example. But the sad thing for us was that it seemed as though, these homeland regions were put into places where connected people to the nationalist government of the time weren't as much affected. You know, you didn't find these homeland regions around the Transvaal and around the Free State and even around the Cape. So, and there were thousands of farmers, you know, who were just basically told that your life's work is now gone. We're going to pay you what we feel you should be paid, and you must move on. And, you know, that only happened to most people once. You know, to my family, it happened twice. And I just feel that this type of a thing of you know, forced expropriation needs to be a lesson learned, because it disrupts lives. It creates a lot of knock-on effects, you know, unintended knock-on effects. I mean, we've got this expropriation drive in the country at the moment to want to expropriate. But I'll get later onto what that can do to the food security of this country and what solutions there are to rather put in place to avoid that type of a scenario. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. When you talk about labour pools, just tell us what decade we're talking about with these expropriations that happened, and just unpack what you mean when you talk about labour reservoirs.
These homeland states, or homeland Bantustans, or the homelands as they called them, you know, were meant to be these independent states like we know. And I cover in my book how they were actually planned to be a lot larger than what they were. And when Verwoerd was assassinated, that expansion of these areas came to an end. But basically, they were far too small to be self-sustained and be sustainable. So, you know, you had all these people living in these areas that couldn't really make it, you know, from that land, because these were like agrarian societies. These were societies trying to make headway from agriculture. And even in those years, in the 1970s, agriculture was already reaching a point where it almost became impossible to survive on a sort of a subsistence farming basis. You know, we had I mean, our population is increasing in size all the time. You know, and land is finite. You know, it's not something that you can increase in size. So what effectively occurred was that most of the folk living in these areas had to go, you know, join the mines in Joburg and became migrant laborers, which created a whole nother set of problems, because now we had these fragmented families. You know, so as I say to you, I don't think the concept was very well thought out. But I do, as I interrogate in my book, and these are very, very touchy subjects, you know, I think that the government of the day in 1933, when this whole separate development thing started, I don't think their plan was completely only about segregating black and white. I think it was more sort of a self-preservation of the Afrikaner people. And I go into my book in detail. I'm not going to go into it now, but what caused this feeling of nationalism and, you know, wanting to preserve it, a lot of it came in the aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War, when a lot of the Boer people were actually decimated. And I think a lot of that type of nationalistic feeling has also come after the apartheid system. That created a lot of problems in many people's lives. So we need to try to break that cycle of trying to create a system, you know, where we are going to be segregated, you know, in our little communities. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we've got the Cape Exit movement. We've got a lot of different organizations that want to break away. And later in the discussion, we will talk about what I spoke about, the balkanization of South Africa. But so, yes, these were basically labor reservoirs. And I mentioned in my book that unfortunately, you know, today I view a lot of these regions as just being vote reservoirs, you know, because a lot of these people living in these former homeland regions can't make it. There's a total lack of capacity. There's a total lack of funding to try and help these people to make a go of farming in these areas. And these are vast areas. I mean, we're not talking about a few thousand hectares. I mean, we're talking about 16 million hectares of South Africa, which is 122 million hectares in extent. And a lot of these places have got very, very good irrigation schemes, which are worth a huge amount of money, and that could be really generating jobs and that sort of thing. So, I come back to my story that the land would wail, is that there is so much opportunity out there, but the policies are not there, and the understanding of how to make this whole thing a good thing is just not there, in my opinion. And as I say, I worked through that for 12 years, and I saw what a lot of the constraints were, what a lot of the challenges were. And if policymakers would just look at little microcosmic examples of the work that I did and the communities I worked in, I think we could really have a way forward in terms of the land issue in South Africa.
So you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense, that deep generational trauma actually produces an increase in nationalism, which is quite understandable. I want you to touch on, you've talked about forced expropriations in your families created a tremendous amount of trauma, as we've mentioned, but I want you to unpack your terrible experience as a victim of the bombing of the Spur in Queenstown, because that involved you and your sister and friends. This is not just one incident. You've now got a traumatic event that you experienced. Just tell us what happened around that time.
Bev, that was during a time when I was basically finishing up at university, and I came home for one of the holidays. And, there was this spate of attacks which were occurring throughout South Africa. You may recall the St. James attack. There was the King Williamstown Golf Club attack. And, I put it down to, once again, a jostling for political relevance in certain groups and organizations, because it's quite clear that at the time we'd already had the referendum, to decide whether the country should have majority rule. And I think white South Africans voted overwhelmingly in favor of that. So I just viewed that attack and the other attacks at the time as being very cowardice events, and events that should really not have been, that the TRC should not have given amnesty to, because, these were basically terror events. This wasn't to try to change the trajectory of a society, because that trajectory had already changed. It was already on path to have our first democratic elections. So, to basically cut a long story short, we went to the Spur. It was my first night home. I went with my two sisters, and we sat a meter away from where limpet mine had been planted. And literally five minutes later, the bomb went off. I was blown through the ceiling. When I turned around and looked, I just saw absolute devastation, which is in a photograph in the book. I saw people lying all over the place. There was a guy lying next to me with a shattered leg. The searing heat in the place. Our hair was on fire. A lot of the people's clothes were on fire. So it was a very traumatic event. And, I mention these things in the book, and I mention the expropriation of our farms, not to seek sympathy, because, as I said, when we were expropriated, we didn't sit back and think, well, now we've been victims of the system. We now need the system to pay us back. We basically went on and, to rebuild our lives. And so I mention these things, and I also mention the history of my family in the book, where I come from two lots. I come from two lots of orphan lines on my mom and my dad's side. Some of my ancestors were Jews that came from Lithuania, trying to pilgrims there. So they came here not as migrants, but as refugees. So, I'm not trying to put the word forward that we need to completely forget about the past, but I maintain that living a life waiting for someone to redress or to compensate you, is not how we viewed it. We took the bull by the horns, in other words. As a farmer, we often use that saying, and we just try to make headway. And it was very difficult, to keep on trying to rebuild your life. And I mention that in the book because I know that there are many Black South Africans who have been through very, very traumatic phases in their life. But I just try to put the message forward that we need to keep on building and trying to reconstruct rather than trying to want a sense of redress all the time. And I think that the policymakers of the country have got a very great role to play in that, which I think we'll address a little bit further too, in the interview.
So, you challenge simple narratives about colonizers and victims, which you've just touched on now. You include the brutality within African kingdoms, so within the tribes and early settler violence. You say that reconciliation requires embracing complexity, not denial. And you assert that this is not about rewriting history, it's about repairing what has never been told. You carry this thread throughout the book. Expand a bit on that.
To come back to that, from all sides of the spectrum in South Africa, from the political spectrum, from the societal spectrum, we need to admit that there were wrongs, undertaken in the past. These wrongs are not, however, specific to only certain ethnic groups. If one speaks about the Mfetane, which was, labeled as being intertribal wars during the time of the settlers being here and even prior to that, there are a lot of narratives that would explain that these occurred because of settlers being here. And I don't always think when I look at my research that is 100% certain. The involvement of settlers may have exacerbated situations, but I don't think it is fair to say that these interactions occurred solely because of settler involvement. I mean, a very interesting story was, for example, when Mzilikazi, who was one of Shaka's lieutenants, raided cattle from a neighboring clan and didn't give the cattle to Shaka, and Shaka wasn't very happy about it and wanted to put him to death. So he went over the Drakensberg with a little group of supporters, and a lot of mayhem went on there, where a lot of other clans and groups were affected by the warring that went on there. So, there are many ways that we can frame history. We can try explain why we've got these conflicts. And, we can look at this scenario too, when a guy called Matiwane, who was also under Shaka's sort of rule, he was part of the Zulu setup, did a similar thing and was also expelled from Zululand and came down toward the Eastern Cape and started having conflict there with the Xhosa people. And not many history books will explain to you that a settler group actually assisted the Xhosa to dispel Matiwane and the Amangwane people. And then you'll have stories, that the settlers only went there to look for slaves. This is why they went to assist against Matiwane. But the narrative doesn't tell you that the British had banned slavery between the colonies as far back as 1808. They were still allowing slavery in the colonies up to 1838, up to 1834. But this conflict between a settler grouping and Xhosa grouping against Matiwane occurred in 1828. So, I don't buy the story that it was solely just to go get slaves. I think there was some type of a collaboration. Maybe it was an uneasy one. But I just think that if the idea was to crush the Xhosa or to crush the Zulu, then it would have been a divide and rule strategy. Let the Zulus come in, crush the Xhosa, and then we will crush, the Zulu type of a story, which is quite widely documented in countries like America, where the stronger indigenous tribes were given horses and guns to wipe the others out. And then, they were later wiped out. So it's all these little intricacies of history, which I urge people to go and to read. And to, I'm not for a second saying that the British Empire has got no blood on their hands. I mean, we know that they were very vociferous and very harsh on their empire building. But I think there's all these little things in our history that we need to better understand if we need to or we want to go forward and get rid of this acrimonious past. I just can't see that as a society we are going to ever get anywhere if we continue with acrimony and we continue, expecting redress and we continue wanting to punish and retribute, because of sins of the past. I mean, we often hear about the original sin. I mean, when are we going to get past that? When are we going to say, well, these sins happened. We accept that they happened. But is it going to be good for our country if we just keep on hammering away at wanting to punish? So that is my feeling in terms of that.
It makes sense if you think about, the Vietnam War, for example. If everybody was still so acrimonious, the world would never be able to get on. And, I think Singapore's done has a very good example of moving on from atrocities, being able to build rather than break down. And that's a very good point that you have raised that South Africa struggles with. But it leads on to where I'm going now, where you write about the past does not rest. It lingers in broken homesteads and overgrown graveyards. To walk forward, we must first walk backward. I mean, can you explain this? What does it mean in the context of South Africa's fractured national identity that we currently have?
If you go and you look at, for example, what I mentioned about the former homeland regions, we had these highly functional commercial farms, which I've got photos of how they looked in the book and how they look now, today. And, I've just almost get this feeling that when you have a system of expropriation as an example, and you take land and you give it to another ethnic group or whatever, if that came to some sort of a positive outcome, maybe that sacrifice would be worth it. So we need to go back and look, what has happened, not only in our neighborhood, but what happened, for example, in Zimbabwe. And I know that people hate raising the issue about Zimbabwe. But he tells us, we've got these historical examples of what happens when things are undertaken without thinking carefully about them. Like I maintain, I don't think that the apartheid homeland system was very carefully thought about. It was a concept about nationalization, about trying to keep a sort of a national identity for certain groups. And we've still got that feeling. So, when I say if we need to make progress, we need to go backwards. We need to go look at what the mistakes of history are. And if we don't look at them, and unfortunately, many people today are not interested in history. We hear too that when you leave school, you need to go study maths and science. Yes, vitally important. We live in the age of tech. Those are important subjects. But I just feel that many of our future leaders, many of our youth don't understand their own history, and they don't understand what mistakes were made. And if you go further afield and you look at what happened under Stalin with the kulaks, when he wanted to collectivize all farms, he nationalized everything. Millions of people died in famine. Millions of people in Zimbabwe have been displaced. Many are suffering hardship and famine there at the moment. And often all in the name of ideology. So I'm not here, as I say, to justify any past system. I just mention these old settler families because I would also like people to understand that they didn't have this very simple life where they just got this land and out of the blue came these fantastic commercial farms. And I often think that people look at farming and think, well, this is, these people are very wealthy. They make huge amounts of money. But very few people will understand that the commercial farming sector in this country carries a debt of 200 billion rand. There are only about 40,000 farmers left, commercial farmers. Some estimates put them at 32,000. And I know for a fact that more fall away almost every month. So, my whole message is not to glorify settlers or to glorify, the past. I document my past and I ask very hard questions to ask. You'll note in my book, I posed, the question and said, what were these settlers thinking coming to a place and just expecting to take land from other people? And then I went to their history of land dispossession in Ireland and in Britain. The Romans once invaded Britain. I mean, the British had the whiphold over the Irish for centuries. I mean, you go look at the potato famine, which I mentioned in my book. So it's all these little junctures in history why I say we need to step back if we want to move forward. I hope that also makes sense.
I think the question we can perhaps unpack later is really how do we move forward with such contested and wounded memories that we seem to hold on to where other nations are able to move past. And, I'm not sure that we have an answer around that yet, or whether you have mentioned that we basically just have to make a decision. But we can talk about that a little later. What I want to bring us back to your comments around Zimbabwe. You raised the Cold War hypocrisy around Mugabe and the Western business interests at large. And, go back a little bit back to the former Rhodesia. Who really benefited from this collapse?
Bev, that I looked at that whole Rhodesian. I've read Ian Smith's books. I've watched lots of speeches by Robert Mugabe over time. So once again, it's not as though I'm taking one sort of aside there. I just look at this scenario of a very ironic situation was that during the armed struggle in Zimbabwe, the Soviets and the Chinese propped up a lot of those groups, including Robert Mugabe. And the funny thing was that during the Cold War, South Africa was an ally of the US because it was also anti-communist. The US were vehemently anti-communists, so was South Africa. When the Cold War actually ended, and I don't know if it's really ended, but, if you see what's going on at the moment, but when it was sort of officially ended, the anti-communist thing suddenly fell away. And we had this great drive by the US and, diplomats from the US and people involved in talks with Ian Smith's government to hand over power, which I think would have happened in any case. But I think the expediency there was so that it was done very uncontrolled. And if you consider that one would think that when Zimbabwe got independence in 1980, that the first sort of embassy there would have been a Russian embassy, or would have been a Chinese embassy. But funnily enough, within days or weeks after that, the US embassy was the first one that opened there. And if you consider that Robert Mugabe did have a lot of socialist, communist type of thoughts in his mind, it just was, for me, it was quite ironic that, the US would have been so supportive of that system. And once again, I'm not saying that Rhodesia shouldn't have ended, but I think there are ways of doing things which are right and there are ways are wrong that can lead to great, trauma and great problems going forward. And I think what eventually happened in Zimbabwe is proof of my fears of things going very, very badly wrong if they are undertaken correctly. Like, I want land reform in this country. I mean, I want it. And this is why I help emerging farmers, I help communal farmers. But if it's undertaken incorrectly, solely for ideology, we are going to find ourselves in an absolutely perfect storm. We've got a high unemployment rate. We've got a stagnant economy. If food security fails in this country, then we've got a major problem, a very, very big problem.
Right. You say that South Africans have lost the skill of their ancestors to live off the land. Returning to the soil is an invitation to listen. So what does that look like in particular with regards to today's youth that are growing up into adults with their disconnection from land South Africa?
It's vitally important for our youth today to understand, that land is something that is finite, but society is ever evolving and ever changing. If we go back, let's call it 100 years, we only had a few million people living in South Africa. It would have maybe been 3-4 million people. Today we've got 60 million so-called documented people, let's call them citizens, and we may have an untold amount of other people who have come in from Zimbabwe or Malawi or wherever. So the disconnect with, how to survive from the land is not just for one ethnic group, it's for most ethnic groups. Because if you go throughout the world, you go to the US, only about 1% of people own farmland and farm. It may be slightly under that in Britain. In France, it's probably only 0.5% of the population farm. So we come through the Industrial Revolution, which changed a lot of lives. It took many people off the land in Britain, all over the world, and it forced them into cities. But I think what is so important is for our youth to understand that you've got two very complex scenarios in terms of land. You've got the ideological side, where a lot of politicians are telling us, that you're never going to get anywhere without land. And then you've got this very harsh reality that it's impossible to take, for example, 60 million South Africans and put them onto the land. Because if you look at, there's a lot of very intricate agricultural data and stats, which I mentioned in my book. For example, you need 8 hectares to raise 1 cow. Now, people would think that that's crazy because 8 hectares is about 10 rugby fields, which is quite a vast size of land. But to be able to feed the population, you need to extract absolute maximum value from that land. And, the ideological calls just to have that land, for some type of a political movement or whatever, can be very dangerous. And I later go into, in my work, which I did in the Harewood district, I worked on about 100,000 hectares there of the 16 million hectares of former homeland regions. And I discovered some shocking stats there. In that region, I worked out that communal farmers run at a 400 million rand loss compared to their commercial farmer counterparts, just on that 100,000 hectares. That is getting way less for wool, sheep's wool, getting way less for beef. I mean, there are some very interesting stats. For example, there are roughly about 15 million cattle in South Africa. Half of those are owned by black communal and emerging farmers, but only about 10% of their cattle get into formal markets. So there are these big disconnects of what is happening on the land. I mean, if you upscale that loss of 400 million rand in Harewood to the other 16 million hectares, it comes out to something like 130 billion rand is lost each year in the former homeland regions that could not be lost if there were just very basic ways of how to empower these people and how to capacitate them and how to support them. They've got a natural land asset of also about 130 billion rand. I mean, 16 million hectares at roughly 8,000 rand a hectare comes to a vast amount of money. But these are areas that are plagued by poverty and plagued by hardship. Why is that the case? Where are the policymakers? Where is our Department of Agriculture? In all the years that I worked in that region, I met 2 extension officers only once in 12 years. These people sit in the offices in the towns and cities, and there's not much happening. So there's a lot of these factors, that the youth don't understand. And I know it's very, very difficult to explain things like this, because if you don't know agriculture, you wouldn't know it. So I try to educate people that, yes, land is important, but there are ways that we can get more people onto the land. I mean, I mentioned in my book about the irrigation schemes, which are worth huge amounts of money and could be putting out billions of rands that could be employing tens of thousands of people. And these places are lying fallow. So it's a very, very complex situation to try blend or to try marry ideology with reality. Unfortunately, this is not going back 100 years where there's vast amounts of land that, anybody who wants to go take some should be taking it. And I'm not for a second saying that I don't believe that black farmers should be given the opportunity to become commercial farmers. But if you look at the losses I mentioned up to now, the collective debts, and the fact that our commercial numbers have dropped from 120,000 in 1990 to 40,000 now, and more falling off the bandwagon all the time. I mean, I mentioned a very interesting story of a friend of mine who had a dairy in Queenstown. He was producing, and he was a brilliant farmer. He had a degree. He was a hard worker. He was producing R1 million worth of milk a month, but his input costs were 1.1 million. So he was running at 100,000 rand loss. And this is a guy who knew exactly what to do on the land to extract maximum value out of it. Now, my question in the book too, do we take novice people without training them, without supporting them? Unfortunately, farming brings income in twice a year in most instances. In dairies, it's like a daily or weekly thing, but in most livestock farming and in crop farming, you get income twice a year, but you've got daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly costs. And this is why a lot of the formerly expropriated farms after 1994 have failed. It's got nothing to do with black farmers being useless or not knowing how to farm. You're just not going to make it if the support structures aren't there. And as I say, if you go into these areas and you do it right, you can make very big, very massive strides and positive change.
So Shane, just unpack the schemes that you mentioned that is a real solution for opportunity.
Bev, we hear about these cases of that, we need land and we can't survive without it, and we need opportunity. Now, I often ask on some of the forums and WhatsApp groups I've been on, what has been done about these irrigation schemes, for example, in the former Transkei and Ciskei region, which are fully capacitated. I mean, they've got the best center pivots, but I'm talking land that can be worth anything up to 300,000 rand a hectare. They are water rich. They've got constant water, but there's very little, if not nothing happening there. So where are the policymakers? Where are these people who are crying for this land? That is of the most valuable land in South Africa. We need to understand that of the agricultural land in South Africa, unlike many, many other countries, only 3% of the agricultural land, which is a minuscule amount, is regarded as being truly fertile, which can be irrigated. About 13% of the land is viewed as being arable, but in terms of like dry land, which when I say that, I mean relying on like rainfall. The rest of the land is not really arable. It's used for livestock farming. And as I said to you, there are some, on average, you need 8 hectares to run one cow, but there are places of South Africa like the Northern Cape where you need 40 or 50 hectares just to run one cow. And if you get that wrong, if you put people onto land and you get those carrying capacities and stocking rates wrong, that land will degrade to a point that it'll take generations to come right. And I also mention this in my book. I've got very descriptive photographs of how that looks. So these are vitally important, dynamics and stats that if we work through them properly and we have a proper land summit and we get people together, we can solve this land issue, because unfortunately the land issue, once again, quote unquote, is driving populism. It's driving wedges between communities. It is causing people to want to have their own homeland states. It is causing people to want to withdraw from the rest of South Africa. And I often say, we hear about the deindustrialization of South Africa, and we often only hear in business chats about industry, what's happening in our industry. But we don't hear about what should be happening in agriculture, which is actually one of the only growing sectors in the country. And although it only may contribute, it's increasing all the time, because, as I said, it's one of the only sectors. It may not be a major GDP contributor. I think when I looked last, it was 8%. It's gone up to 15% now. And if you look at all the satellite industries around it, The processing plants. Why aren't we bringing historically disadvantaged people into the processing side of agriculture? If you walk into a supermarket, you'll see yogurts, you'll see cheese, you'll see wheat picks, you'll see all sorts of products which come off our farms. You can empower people not only by giving them land, which they are going to find it very hard to make a living on, but you can empower them like we go back to when Afrikaners took over in the early 1900s. They found it hard to break into the mining sector because everybody viewed, mining is our industry. You've got to get into that. So what did they do? They went and they created things like ISCO, which could take raw product from the mines, add value to it, and pull people into business. That can be done with agriculture in this country, and I just, for the life of me, can't understand why it hasn't been done yet, or why aren't we looking at that? We're not only looking at massive job creation in the satellite industries, but we're looking at a capacity to pull this country out of the mess that we're in and put us into a positive growth rate.
So, Shane, you raise a very important point for someone who's been in Parliament for agriculture, fully understand it. It's not only just about the land, it's also about the opportunities, employment opportunities in areas where there is no manufacturing and commerce. It sounds like a no-brainer why government isn't doing that. Do you think it's deliberate?
Bev, we get onto very shaky ground when you ask me that question, because I'm quite outspoken in terms of what I feel is actually happening in this country. I don't feel that government wants people to progress. The welfare state is a very well-known sort of a strategy when it comes to keeping people dependent. Because I've asked many, many times, why don't the folk living in the homelands get title to their land? Because a lot of those people know how to farm, but can't go to a bank or financing institution and loan money because he's got no, or she has got no collateral. So this whole feeling that, we should now nationalize everything and put everything under state control. If you go look at our SOEs, I think once again, I say if we need to go forward, we need to go backwards. What has happened to our Eskom? What has happened to SOA? They've all imploded. So I do feel that there is a sort of a deliberate want not to give people opportunity, because folk with opportunity can start thinking for themselves. It's a very well-known factor that when you develop a middle class, you allow for people who have got more means and can think more for themselves. And, I've often spoken to that one of the biggest sectors in this country is the street informal sector, vendors. You can go to any town and city and see some folk who are selling vegetables, who are selling tomatoes that come off our farms. Capacitate those people, build markets in our big cities for those folk to go and to have kiosks where they can sell, act as a middle person between our farms and the public. These are all things that can be very simply put into place. We're always trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to say, but what can we do to create jobs? What can we do? Empower these people who already know how to run their own businesses. I would guess that there are millions of vendors on our streets, selling off cardboard boxes. That's all job creation. Those are entrepreneurs. And I go back in my book where I mentioned that Professor Robert Gumede said that when apartheid ended, there were 5 million black entrepreneurs in this country who owned their own businesses. But then we found it more apt to take R1 trillion and give it to 100 people. What if we had taken that R1 trillion and given it to those 5 million entrepreneurs? What would our business landscape look like now? What would our farming landscape look like if we only took the expropriated farms and we took these irrigation schemes and we put a little bit of effort into it and made them work? So to come back to your question, I often get the impression that maybe the policymakers don't actually want it to actually work.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like that. Shane, what role should heritage preservation of graves, of stories, of buildings play in South Africa's future rebuilding? I mean, you talk a lot about that throughout your book.
You know, this whole feeling that you want to decolonize and you want to erase because it's a painful past, I don't think assists future generations to learn from the past, if you know what I mean. You know, you can go into some of our museums and to some of our monuments, and a lot of the past has actually been erased. You know, and I just feel that don't dwell and live in the past, but keep on going back to it to see where we want to go to. You know, we look at these very old, fancy buildings that come from a colonial era. I mean, you can go through my book, you know, in Queenstown, and I'll show you the old town hall that was well over 150 years old, which got gutted by fire, you know, and there's been no plans to fix it. I mean, most of the old historical buildings there have been gutted. Our public swimming bath in Queenstown, which was like an Olympic-sized one, is now just a hole in the ground. And, you know, what could that have done for future you know, for modern children, you know, contemporary children that should be learning how to swim, as an example. I mean, how many children don't we hear who drown? You know, I'm just using a little anecdote here, but, you know, I just feel that preserving our past and our history may not be nice for everybody. I mean, there are some histories that I wouldn't like to, you know, think about. Like when I see, you know, I go into our museums and I see there's an UPLA uniform there. You know, I had a bad experience with UPLA, but it teaches me to understand where we come from, that we don't come from a perfect past. So when I think about how to change things in the future, I think about looking at all those little acrimonies or little things of the past, and that's how you fix things. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the memories allow us to understand where we come from in order for us to go forward, is what I'm hearing what you say. So you talk about land not as a political token, which you've emphasized, but as a spiritual inheritance. So, you know, what do you think is the ethical obligation of both current landowners and beneficiaries of redistribution?
Current landowners, a lot of them who I know, you know, are trying their best, you know, to try to change things, you know, in their own little ways. I mean, I look in Albany, you know, there's a lot of transformation now in terms of who are farm managers. You know, you can go back decades and you may find that all farm managers were white. I mean, a lot of the farm managers I meet in the Albany area now are black guys who are being trained very, very well, you know, who know exactly what they're doing. Now, these guys could very well be beneficiaries of expropriated farms, you know, and if you want to look at the redress and like the transformative side of things, in terms of new land beneficiaries, I just come back to the point that people need to demand more in terms of assistance and responsibility. You know, this idea that we're just going to take a farm and we're going to stick a guy onto it and he's going to make a living there, you know, is just completely irrational thinking. It just can't work. So these people that get this land and get these farms need to hold government and policymakers to account. It can't just be, you know, that we've now got the ideological thing right. We've taken, for argument's sake, 4,000 farms and we've put black farmers onto them. But what if those black farmers are not going to make it there, which is quite clear in what we've seen up to now. So when I say it's a spiritual thing too, a lot of these people have got this attachment to land, may they be black or white. So it's not only, you know, I've spoken a lot about the commercial side of things, but it's to try and marry that idea of the spiritual side with the realistic commercial side of it. You know, we can't just have a farm because we feel that our ancestors or my settler ancestors fought for that, or these ancestors fought for this. It's a very complex situation and it's not easy, but there are ways that we can do it. Like I said, you take the land that we've got, which is lying fallow, take these irrigation schemes, which are thousands of hectares, take these farms, which I've seen, which were expropriated since 1994, which a lot of them are lying fallow and completely broken. The buildings are broken, the water pumps don't work. Recapitalize them, make them work, but do not do it through government schemes, which just become another ransacking exercise.
Sure.
I think what we need to do, we hear about a national dialogue in this country at the moment, and there's a lot of people saying that they don't believe in that because it's just going to eat up more money and it's not going to result in anything. Like the Zondo Commission hasn't really resulted in much occurring to people who have had fingers, actually, pointed at them. So I just maintain that we need to keep on using the strong voices, guys like Rob Hersov, guys like Prince Mashele, guys like R.W. Johnson, guys like Vusi Tembakwayo. I mean, guys that speak sense, guys that know what direction we need to be moving in. Get a structure going where we have a public-private partnership. We have oversight from independent auditing organizations that go and say, this is a land that we want to capacitate. We take these irrigation schemes, we train people, we capacitate them, we take all these farms which are lying broken and fallow, and we do the same thing. And for that matter, that overreaching body can get into business, it can get into industry, it can get into mining. It just needs the right people there. And I'm not saying completely exclude government. Government should have a role in it. But our problems are not going to be sorted out when we read about malfeasance all the time. We need these outer bodies who are coming out with their very, very strong voices and these personalities. We need to form this national committee and use that to drive change in this country. And we need to go and say, we understand this happened wrong in the past, and we're not defending that. So it's these types of think tanks. I mean, Rob Hersov mentioned guys that he looks up to, guys like Prince Mashele, like R.W. Johnson. There's a lot of these guys out there. Get these guys around the table. Let's get a think tank going. That's how I feel that, we can move forward.
And then just going further back to the Eastern Cape, you warned that the Eastern Cape histories are under huge threat of being forgotten completely. What key truths do you think you need to preserve from this region before they're lost in time? I mean, it's obviously also a very big traditional leader owned land space. So how do we preserve the heart of history, where all three histories converge? You talk about the 1820 settlers, you're talking about what you call the trap Boers, you're talking about traditional communities in the area. How do we preserve that knowledge?
Bev, what we do there is that we create these committees of people. You can have regional ones, you can have provincial ones of that concept, which I just now recently mentioned. A very interesting thing about the preservation of history, if you go to Bathurst, which is now the heartland of settler country, it was one of the first settlements in Lower Albany. You've got a memorial there called the Topescop, which originally only used to commemorate the settler parties that landed there. There's like plaques on this thing. It's a round shape, showing where they settled, what the direction is, who the settler party leaders were, what ships they came out on. And in more recent years, they included the Xhosa clans and chiefs onto that monument, which I think was a good thing. It was it is like a reconciliatory, sort of a gesture. We understand what happened in the frontier wars here. I mean, it was a brutal conflict. It went on for a long time. But like I say, we need to preserve that history, because I keep on coming back to what I'm saying is that we can't fix a country if we don't know what broke it. I actually mentioned that in my book. And, you know, a lot of people are tired of hearing about reconciliation and rainbow nations because a lot of it has actually boiled down to nothing. You know, we've gone backwards. Our economy has shrunk. I think, you know, race or ethnic politics is at an all-time high, which I don't think is good for any of us. I think that it's not going to put us in the place where the average person in this country does actually not want conflict. You know, unfortunately, we hear about the radical left and the radical right, but they always get the most or the loudest voice. More so in the media because, you know, the media loves alarmism and they love acrimony because that's what sells books. That's what gets people watching things. You know, nice stories about furtherance. Unfortunately, folk don't like watching those things. You know, so to say, to answer your question, you know, how do we preserve this and why should we? We preserve this because conflict and the past needs to be accepted by all parties. And from that, we should then have a proper national dialogue as to how we want to go forward. But you're never going to have anything coming without civil society being part of that and with clever people who know what they're doing as being part of that and being drivers in that. I mean, let's look at, I didn't even mention Robert Gumede, you know, hell of a clever guy. I mean, he knows exactly what he's doing. Why hasn't he been pulled more into policy making? But then we're going back to the old question. Do we actually want to see change or not? You know, do we want to see a decaying society where malfeasance could be a lot easier? Or do we want a functional society where we are consistently uplifting people? So I keep on mentioning this history, and I mention little anecdotes in the book about how the settlers assisted the Xhosa. And obviously, you're going to get your modern academics to say that's a lot of nonsense. You know, it didn't actually happen that way. But let people work it out in their own minds. You know, which is why I say let people read my book and work out what I say. Is it completely fabricated, or does it actually make some type of sense?
No, your book certainly has a lot of research links there to which people can actually verify statistics. Let's go to where you've mentioned Rob Hersov. And you said that, Rob said that the expropriation bill is a loaded gun in a room full of children. I mean, why, and link it also with BEE, why is this metaphor so potent and what alternatives should we be looking at? I mean, you've been talking about that, but let's bring it right back, right here to present day on what you thought Rob was meaning there.
I just found that quote by Rob to be very, very potent, and it actually made a lot of sense. You know, the idea that we have an expropriation bill without compensation could be fine in terms of having even like a semi-functional government, you know, but what happens when you get a government that decides, well, we're going to enact that law? You know, we're told that you can go to court and you can do this and do that, but how many landowners will be able to wait 3 to 4 years to get into court once they've had their land, you know, expropriated? How do they fight these legal costs? I mean, you know, most farmers, as an example, as I say to you today, a lot of them are actually technically insolvent. They don't have extra money to fight a court case. And the whole concept, Bev, of expropriation makes a lot of sense when it's actually in the public interest. You know, if you go look at, we need a new highway, I've got no issue with that. But the problem is, how do you define what is in the public interest? You know, if you had a list of, we will only expropriate on these certain terms or for this interest, you know, one could understand that. But I just feel that that is a completely dystopian law. It is a law that is really, really very, very dangerous. And it should not be viewed, my concern should not be viewed like it has been put across that I'm anti-transformation. I'm anti-BEE, because you asked me about BEE too. I think it's become very, very clear what BEE means. It means the enrichment of a tiny minority of well-connected politicians and their cronies. Throughout my work over 12 years, I saw what could have been done with the amounts of money. I mean, let's go back to the 1 trillion rand that was given to 100 people. You know, that 1 trillion rand could have bought all grazing farms in South Africa. It could have bought them outright overnight. The government could have said, we bought this land, we are giving it to the people who we feel need to get that land. So, you know, we hear stories that try to empower this expropriation law, and I've read a lot of them in the past, that, you know, white commercial farmers don't want to sell to government, which is a complete fallacy, because you can go onto any advertising forum, and at any given time, there are thousands of farms there for sale. Nobody's going to question who the buyer is, but you can't expect a seller to wait 5 years, you know, because of poor policy, of inept people handling those deals, and then turn around and say, oh, but, you know, this has become a racial thing. You know, it isn't so. It's an absolute fallacy. And I just want people to understand too, all this misinformation and also disinformation. It's just, I think it's come out enough, you know, than for me to explain why BEE has failed. I mean, this is in our contemporary discourse. I mean, all these news stories are coming out all the time. I mean, if a guy like Robert Kumede can come out after a very in-depth study and say that 1 trillion rand went to 100 people, I mean, who doesn't find that wrong? I mean, who doesn't find that as being completely incorrect? I mean, I can think back to one of the droughts which occurred in the Harewood district when I was running a project there. And these poor farmers needed drought aid. I mean, they were in desperate need of it. I mean, the cattle were dying in huge numbers. So I then tried to facilitate this drought aid. I wrote a business plan for it. Well, at the end of the day, 1 bale of grass arrived there. 1 bale. To the point where the farmer said, you can take your bale and you can shove it. I mean, we'd rather let our cattle die. So where is BEE? You know, who's it affecting? Who's it helping? Who's it enriching? I would once again like our youth to ask these imperative questions. I'm not against BEE. If it is undertaken properly, I mean, you'll get folk who are completely against it. Oh, why should we help anybody? I maintain help these people. You know, they have been through a very, very tough past. I mean, apartheid is real. It you know, caused a lot of problems. But it can't be about tokenism. It can't be about, well, we've now got our 4 billionaires, you know, out in the open space, while we've got a massively increasing unemployment rate, while we've got all these people who can be empowered on these irrigation schemes, on these expropriated farms. So I just feel that, you know, how it is being done at the moment is a complete facade. It's a complete fallacy. And a lot of the commentators are quite right when they say that it is actually a scam. I mean, that's all it is.
Shane, how much land is government holding on to as we stand? I mean, what it can, you know, it's like it's a conundrum in a way. I mean, government, how many millions of hectares does government have?
Bev, they are very, very, it's another thing which I often raise, is that nobody has really taken the time to go interrogate and to work out exactly who owns what. You understand? Because unfortunately, in this country, we attribute land with hectareage. You know, these people own so many hectares, these own so many hectares. Land cannot be judged according to how many hectares you own, because as I mentioned, the Northern Cape province, which is 30% of South Africa, it's almost a third the size of the country, is largely white-owned, but it's also largely desert. So it's actually very low-value land, but it gives a false impression of who extracts value from land, who owns land. I mean, if I'm needing 50 hectares to run one cow, versus in a lot of almost all of the former homeland regions, you are needing between 6 and 8 hectares. And, we are told that these homelands were very bad farming areas. I think I prove in my book that when we farmed in Guba, it was brilliant land. It was very good land. So all these facts and figures about who owns what land, and we're only working on like hectareage. I mean, like I say, if you take the irrigation schemes in South Africa, and it isn't only in the former Ciskei and Transkei, apparently there are 50,000 hectares of smallholder irrigation schemes, which have all failed or are failing because these people are farming on 1 or 2 plots on those irrigation schemes, but have got no capacity or assistance how to get produce from there into our markets. The simplest thing is to have trucks just assisting those people to take their cabbages and their whatever into our formal markets. So these irrigation schemes are worth up to 300,000 Rand per hectare. Whereas I would guess there are certain places in the Northern Cape which wouldn't be worth more than 1,500 Rand a hectare. But because there is a demographic reflection there, it now creates a big problem. And I also want our youth and I want folk to understand that it's not always about how much. I mean, I could own 4 clapped out little cars and my neighbor could own a Rolls Royce. I mean, who's got more value in vehicles? You know what I'm saying? So it's all these dynamics that I would expect our policymakers and our opposition parties to actually speak about and to interrogate and to go ask them what has happened to the thousands of already expropriating farms. Why are they lying there, not producing, when we've got guys hopping up and down in Parliament shouting, we want more land? It's a very, very simple question.
So you made a very interesting point, because if I think of my past in chairing committees in agriculture, we only looked at hectares because we've been told that's how the policy is written. It does, as you say, it looks at hectares of land and who owns, what demographic owns a percentage of those total hectares. But you're suggesting, and where I make comment and suggest, then perhaps we should have a heat map overlaid over the most agricultural sensitive land in South Africa as no-go areas of land distribution in terms of breaking it up into smaller pieces, because it's the breadbasket land of South Africa. And so with that heat map, that land is sensitively looked after. Whoever's got it, whoever wants to sell it, whoever gets it, if there is expropriation or if there is a sale, that those people can equally contribute to the land, to the food basket of South Africa, rather than actually looking at demographic ownership of land. And that's the first time I've ever got to think of land in that way. That's a very, very important point, and something that needs to possibly change at a policy level. So, again, coming back to what has happened with the visit to the White House, the present geopolitics relationship with the US and South Africa, the issue that has been raised by AfriForum, Solidariteit. How do you feel the silence of, apart from what is, being raised particularly by these visits to the US, but you talk about the silence of the international community saying that they are equally complicit. What should the international community be doing at this stage where we're at such risk?
I just look at what occurred in Zimbabwe. Let's go back to that as an example. What did the international community do when the farmers were completely invaded in Zimbabwe? Right, they targeted sanctions, they had this and that. But unfortunately, too few countries are actually speaking out. We've got Donald Trump in America, who's a very abrasive character, as I mentioned in my book, and he can be very crass, sometimes, but he seems to be one of the only ones who is speaking out about what is occurring in this country. And this country is not about, I want to get away from this thing about black versus white. I'm getting back down to what is right versus wrong. We've got to cut that line between accusing each other of certain things. We need to get back to the good old thing of what is right and what is wrong. And I just feel that the international media is complicit. When AfriForum talks about farm attacks, and I've raised this in the past too, farm attacks don't only affect white farmers. There are many black farmers who have been killed in farm attacks. And what I find funny, and I find very strange, and I'm still yet to try to find some type of an opinion about this. When certain farm attacks occur, the black farm staff are in some instances also attacked and killed. Why is that the case? Because it's not those people who are being so-called robbed of their weapons or of money in safes. It's almost as if they want to exact some type of retribution against them. I don't know if you get what I'm saying there. I would just think that when these attacks happen, these guys would be left because they're not the ones who have got the key to the safe. So there's more in terms of what is occurring in these attacks. And I just want to come back to the point also that it's quite absurd that I know 30 people who have been murdered in farm attacks. I mean, what average person knows 30 people who have been murdered? Not even from one family. Separate people. It's just not normal. It's just not. If you go to like the average citizen and ask them in South Africa, how many people did you actually personally know who have been murdered? They may say one. Most will say, well, we've heard of, murders, but it's not people that we knew. It's absurd that we as a farming sector can know 30 people. Some know more than that. Some know 50 have been murdered. And some may know of 18 or 20, but I would guess that the average must be around about 30. Now, that is just, it's not normal. And when groups like AfriForum and whoever go abroad to complain about this, it's once again not a thing about race. It's not a thing about ethnicity. It's once again about what is right and what's wrong. So when I say that the international community is often complicit, I was horrified to see on some of the news clips coming out of America that this is some right-wing conspiracy, that people are concerned about farm attacks. Others almost like justified it, that, this should be happening because you don't want to give the land back, type of a story. What type of rationality is that? What international community doesn't completely condemn that? So when I say they're complicit, is that they are complicit in their silence and they are complicit in how they are trying to twist things. Because it is just not normal for me to sit as I'm sitting here with a firearm next to me.
So Shane, you're saying that, if I can understand, that farm murders and farm attacks relating to farm murders are across the line of demographic English, Afrikaans farmers. So farmers as a category is a targeted, it seems to be targeted in its as a category of people, and not necessarily only Afrikaans farmers, but farmers in general. But more than likely, because there are still a large number of people that are Afrikaans as well as English, the old settler generations, the old Trakboer generations that are still sitting on farm and feel very close to the farm are victims of these things. So you're saying that farm murders is not normal in this country. Obviously, because you've also mentioned in the book the tremendous torture that is associated with it.
What I'd like to say is this, is that, I used to, for quite a while, almost buy into the concept that it's not politically motivated. I was trying to find the good side of this whole bad, very, very bad thing, that it's just part of our violent crime rate. But no rational person, once again, can insinuate that there's not one or two or three or even five people out there who are not going to take these songs, which are sung about killing and shooting farmers literally. I mean, it's just irrational to think that you're not going to get some type of a nutcase out there who's going to think, well, let's go do it. I mean, we've heard of these cases where these attacks have happened and where the attackers have actually mentioned politics. So it's not a case of that this doesn't actually happen at all. But to come back to, this thing about not being solely an ethnic-based thing, I think it is on one part driven as an ethnic thing, when you've got populists trying to push these narratives and songs. But then I can tell you stories of some of the communal farmers who I've worked with in the past who were woken up in the middle of the night, knock on the door, he opens the front door, a guy's standing with an AK-47, he calls him and his son up, he makes him and his son load all the few sheep they've got from their kraal onto a truck and off the truck drives. And if you do not allow that, they will shoot you. So these farm attacks, quote unquote, are not only happening on our farms. I mean, they're happening throughout our communal farming areas. And it is for this that I support this whole narrative to push that this should be a priority crime. Because, it is just not normal, like I say to you, for me to know 30 people have been murdered. I mean, that is my sector. I can't talk about a nursing sector or a police sector. Oh, there must be lots of cops, a lot of, friends who have been shot and murdered. But I wonder if it's even as high as a number that I know.
Sure.
So it's once again a very emotive thing. And once again,
Sure.
we get these people throwing the politics into the mix. Are you only worried because it's white farmers being attacked? That isn't the point. The point is that it is affecting all rural communities. We've got this little side swap coming in of people singing about a certain sector which they maintain should be shot and killed.
Yeah.
Now, if that is an historical right, fine. I mean, like I say, even preserve those songs in the past, but you don't need to be singing about them now. Like I said, I mean, put them into the archives. Say, no, there was a time that we actually sang these songs because we were at war against the colonists or whatever. So once again, I come back to my thing, preserve this history, but don't, when do we stop the acrimony? That's what I keep on asking.
We're coming towards the end part of your book where you talk about the future. I mean, you predict a balkanized future if the current trajectory continues. What signs are already here? You've mentioned some of the, some of that. And how do you think the trajectory can be reversed for South Africa?
The big thing is that all the signs are there. I mean, I think we've spoken about this in the past. I mean, the past Zulu king said at a stage too that if they do away with Ngonyama Trust, then the Zulus are going to go on their own. We've got the Cape Exit movement. We've got a whole lot of different Cape independence movements. We've got these little communities jumping up like Orania, like Kleinfontein. It's just a natural progression of a failing state. I think R.W. Johnson mentioned, I watch a lot of his stuff. I watch a lot of the BizNews stuff. And he mentioned that for the first time, there seems to be some type of a groundswell to have an independent Cape. And I think it becomes a lot easier when a central government falls apart, because it's very difficult to try to stop that. And if I talk about the balkanization too, I don't necessarily mean independent states. I mean fiefdoms occur. Regional fiefdoms can start jumping up. Some of them can be in the metros, in the townships, where gangsters actually rule suburbs or rule towns or rural areas. And I ask the question, do we want that? I don't think we do, because already this country has got many, many different ethnic groups. If we like it or not, I mean, we've got Sutus, Zulus, ex-settlers, Boers, I mean, call them what you want. And it just becomes a lot more possible for the balkanization of this country when our central governance system falls apart and mayhem sits in. And how do we stop that? We need to have things, like I said, national dialogues about land, because I've always said that when you solve the land issue and you allow people to understand the intricacies of land and what the risks are and what the costs are to be a landowner and to produce food and that sort of thing, people may have a far better idea of what we're looking at. And it may create a better sense of unity and a want to walk and work in the same direction. So yeah. I believe it can be saved. It can be done. But we just need to get these astute thinkers out there. And we need to get them to form these think tanks. I've actually said in the past, a guy like Rob Hersov should get together with people like R.W. Johnson, like Prince Mashele, have a working committee. It doesn't have to be an official government-sponsored thing or whatever. Get those think tanks together around tables. Get people to advise them on what they think can work in the rural areas, in the former homeland regions, which are vast areas with many millions of people living there. We just need to start thinking more on a civil society basis and hoping, and I don't run all politicians down, but hoping that politicians are going to solve all our problems. The issue is that politicians don't have all the answers. I mean, you rightfully mentioned that you were unaware, or you had never really thought of land being judged on value versus like hectareage. And that is one thing which can be done. I mean, you can have those heat maps and go work out what are the crucially important areas that can. I mean, I keep on coming back to these irrigation schemes. I mean, they are I would rather have one of those irrigation schemes than have the whole of the Northern Cape.
Sure.
That's how valuable I view them as. And if you go look in the past, when schemes like Noga, Bilaite, Kamata, and them were all in full operation, run by American entities during the days of the Transkei, those places were absolutely flourishing. They were exporting huge amounts of products. They were employing thousands of people. Why can't it be redone?
So you, despite that, Shane, have chosen to stay. I mean, what has rooted that decision? And I guess, I mean, I probably do understand it because you've had many of the Afrikaner farmers saying they're not leaving to go to the US either. What is that is so strongly rooted? What is that keeps you here, despite all the trauma you and your family have had to endure?
It's a very simple answer. And lots of folks won't really know, what I mean, but it's a home. I don't really feel I fit in like European culture. I mean, I've traveled quite, widely throughout the world. And it's not, I just wouldn't feel happy abroad. It isn't my culture. And, like I mentioned in my book, why I mentioned all the different ethnicities which I come from. We are all completely unique in this country. I mean, I'm a combination of German, Dutch, Lithuanian, Irish. I don't have one culture which I can prescribe to and say, well, I'm more Irish than I am this, or, my culture is very, very different to the British. Let's call it, for example, the pub culture, or the football culture. Their culture is just completely different. And why I've stayed is that I think that there is still a way to salvage this country. And I think while we are talking at the very moment, things are coming out in an exponential manner. These latest accusations about the top cops in the country, I think is going to open up a can of worms that could very well be a very big impetus for change. I think the public is starting to understand, and the voting bases are starting to learn more and more. I think that 2025 was a sort of a Rubicon year in South Africa. More has happened in terms of our politics in this year than I think has ever happened. We've got more people speaking out. I often follow guys like Neil de Beer too. I watch all Rob stuff. And these guys, it's like it's all actually happening at once. It's growing. We've got all these podcasters who I think are part of your organization, some of them, and folk are listening to what these guys say and what these ladies are saying, and I just think that we mustn't throw in the towel. How can I say, like too early? Because I think we're almost at the summit to start seeing change. And as hard as it's going to be for us, this whole tariff system, is going to put us through a lot of punishment. It's going to cost us dearly, but I think it's going to open up a lot of eyes. And there's probably going to be the spin, that it's the West punishing us because we want redress and that sort of thing. But I think people are getting past that. I think they're starting to realize now. And I mentioned in my book, just one of the final things I'd like to say in terms of this. I mentored 5 young black women who were novice people when I was asked to mentor them in sheep farming. And in 2 years, after 2 years, they won a national award in farming. It's little things like these that, if expanded, can create a very, very big difference. A woman who told me they would actually love to one day own their own farm. They would love to own their own farm. Now that they mustn't actually need to own their own farm. Jacob Zuma talks about going back to a tribal system or a traditional leadership system where we nationalize everything. And seemingly we make people like that now serfs. We put them on the land and we control them, let them farm for us. Like Stalin did to the kulaks. I just think that people like that are starting to understand what things like private property ownership are worth, what it's all about. I think most people in this country would like to own something. It might be a car or a home or something. We can't do away with that aspiration to want to own something, because if you own something, you look after it and you protect it. When you don't own anything, which I often saw in the homeland regions there, when it's said that, that fence is not yours as a community, the government owns it. The first thing a guy does that night, he goes and he pulls the fence down. Or a new shed has been built. It's not your shed. We as the government gave it to you. So what happens that night? Someone goes and takes all the corrugated iron off the roof. And this is what happened on a lot of the expropriated farms. If people had been given title to those farms, it could have made a big difference. But by just saying, well, it's our farm, but you can farm it, why should you look after that? So these are all these little dynamics that we need to think about.
So Shane, ending off, as you started the book with a very powerful quote, you also ended the book with a very powerful comment from your father, who said, "My son, you can escape many things in life, but you will never escape reality." The question is, has this book been cathartic for you? Has it woken the direct situation that South Africa finds itself in? Has it stirred up and not actually healed?
Bev, I think it's a bit of both. It's been very cathartic for me to have gone through, my ancestors' history. because, like I say, I wasn't aware of a lot of the hardships which I actually lived through. I wasn't aware of a lot of the acrimony which occurred, during the frontier wars. I was also not aware of a lot of the good relationships which occurred during the apartheid years. For example, between my family and the Xhosa people. They traded between each other. They viewed each other as friends. It's all those little stories that you don't know, unless you go and you research them. So, for me, and I keep on saying to people, go back and study and learn about your history, because, I mentioned in the book to you that my father would not have been as successful a farmer if it wasn't for the Xhosa people who bought his products, who bought his cattle. So it's these little anecdotes, but there's lots of these around. It's not only in my family. I mean, there are lots of them around. Like you said, you found out about your settler family, and if you go into that, you'll actually learn more. So yeah, it's just about, it was great for me, but I just would like to end my entire thing by saying that we need to start moving away from ideology to function, to functionality and to reality. And that's why I ended with that quote by my father. He said, we can follow what we want to, we can believe what we want to, but there's one thing that doesn't change, and that is reality. Because reality is reality. I mean, it can't be fabricated. What happens, happens. It's there. It's like the air that we breathe. I mean, we can't fabricate that air. That was my final message, is that, we can follow the populists, we can follow the ideology, we can see what happened next door, we can see what happened abroad, and if we don't want to heed those warning signs, then reality is going to come and bite us. It's as simple as that.
Shane, I think this book has really come out at exactly the right time. I think what happened with the visits to the White House allowed people to open up again, and for people across all cultures to start speaking about things that they thought they weren't allowed to speak about before. And it is fascinating to hear the stories of that actually every one of us who are white that live in South Africa have a past which started off either in the 1820 settlers, because technically we're all related, or like me, half 1820 settlers. And on my mother's side, I came from, my mother was Afrikaans, so I came from, as you use the words, trakboers, that came via the wagons. So I carry both sides of an incredible history. And whether our history, and probably the message that I get from you today, it's not about how and without discounting the trauma to the history, it's about recognizing the importance of the history, how good, bad, dark, or light it is, but that history is important in our future and the way we go forward, because it identifies who we are. And when we know who we are, then we can actually walk forward, being able to reconciliate, have more compassion and tolerance for where we all come from, because all of us in South Africa come from a traumatized history. That I can definitely state. So I really welcome your book. I think it is an incredible read. It is what we need, all sides of history here. And yes, maybe not everybody will agree with you, but that doesn't matter. Your story is as important as every one of the stories that come into South Africa, forming our history and our culture. So, Shane Brody, thank you very much. All the best with your book. I look forward to engaging you further, and I'm sure that you are going to stir up a tremendous amount of debate over this book. Thank you so much.